Alrighty, folks. Nice to see you guys. Welcome back to another little one of our 8-push review videos. Today this is for one of our shorter units, Unit 8 here. This shouldn't take too long. I am going to take you through the only two chapters that we have in this weird fugue state rapture of a room. I have no idea why the blinds are doing that. My time might have come, but I like the lighting. It makes me feel like I'm dead in a flashback somewhere. So we're going to keep it. All right. So the first chapter that we're looking at today, that is our First World War. Now, these are the terms that we associated with it, and you may recall the actual mechanics of this war don't really matter from the US perspective. We're only involved in this war for 17 months. So really our impact is pretty minimal in terms of actual the long scope of things. However, the reasons we get involved in the war are very important, and the way the US government changes during and after the war are going to be the big things they want you to focus on. All right? So, let's go ahead and take a look here. All right. So, the first things here is you may recall in our last unit, Unit 7, the progressive era presidents, Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, Woodrow Wilson, they all had very different foreign policies here. Roosevelt was a full-blown imperialist. He was a fan of directly intervening in Latin American affairs. Taft was, we called him a loan shark, dollar diplomacy, economic, informal imperialism. Wilson, a little different. He's a white supremacist, yeah, but he was not exactly that interventionist directly. He was all about protecting democracy and not recognizing countries that are not democratic, that missionary diplomacy there. So we do see, though, he is not above using the military. We saw the example where he kind of invades Mexico because Pancho Villa burned down a town in New Mexico on our side of the border here. And the result is it does show that Wilson is willing to get involved if it means keeping the world safe for democracy. Just kind of have that in your head for later here, because, Wilson's a genius. He knows better than everyone else. If everyone would just listen to Wilson, then nothing would have ever gone wrong, right? Okay. So the actual mechanics of why the war starts, you don't really need to know them for this class. You may recall that lovely little acronym from last year, MAIN. Big militarism, big armies. There are a bunch of tricky alliances, including a bunch of secret ones, like a big spinning web. Industrialization and imperialism have made things a huge deal now. And there's even, colonies in other countries now. And also nationalism, because social Darwinism demands your country expand or die. So, no one saw those big things coming, but they're the reason why just a little squabble between a random Archduke of Austria and some radicals in Serbia, this little tiny shoebox of a country in Europe. I know, insensitive to the Serbians out there. I sincerely apologize. That's why it turned into literally all of Europe and all of its colonies, which makes up the other six continents, are at war now. So, this war quickly changes the way people feel about war. War was kind of an adventure before this. There was people who wanted to, go to war and get medals and have their painting in a cavalry on a horseback. It was a romantic idea there because the 19th century was all about that romanticism. This is what changes that. This war and the horror, the trench warfare, the machines, it makes war uncool. And so we hear these reports of just bodies stacking up, the trench foot in the trenches. We hear about disease running rampant, millions dying at a rate we've never seen before. So the U.S. is horrified by this, but ultimately sees this war as not their problem. There's a few reasons why. One of them is going to be the idea that it really wasn't clear which side we were going to support. Because, I mean, yes, going back to the pip pip cheerio tally ho kind of days, there's a bunch of white Americans that are descended from Britain and they speak English, obviously. But a significant portion of the country to this day are those old immigrants, those Germans and Irish. And so the Irish obviously have no love for the British because of so many good reasons here. That could be a whole separate video. Um, and then the Germans, well, the German side is the main fighter on the Central Powers side. And so it really was unclear which side we would support if we were to declare war. There's no horrible bad guy like what we see in World War II. And so the US is going to declare neutrality. Now, the divided loyalties are one thing, but another couple of big reasons here are the idea that, well, one, it's all the way over there. How could this war on the other side of the Atlantic possibly affect us? Two, there is a love of trade. Wilson is a big fan of what he calls freedom of the seas, the ability to openly trade with any country for economic gain. That's a right that he believes everyone should be allowed to have, and he is worried that cutting off trade with one side is going to infringe on that. Two, the other big thing, America is still in the progressive era. So a lot of ordinary Americans want to keep improving life at home. The election of 1916 was a perfect example of that. We saw that it was a close election, but Wilson is going to barely win because he pretty much says we're not going to war. His campaign slogan was, "He kept us out of the war. Your sons are not going to go get blown up in a trench." And that appealed to enough people. The idea that there's more work to be done at home, and that's what Wilson wants to do. So, up until 1916, America is still actively trying to avoid going to war. What changes? Well, there are a couple things to consider, and really there are issues on both sides. For one, Britain is going to infringe on that right first because they're going to do something that we saw back in the War of 1812. They are going to start searching our ships for contraband and confiscating it. They are infringing on our freedom of the seas. Now, back in 1812, we called this impressment, and it was enough to go to war against Britain. Now, how that war went, check the Unit 3 stuff. That was we totally won that war, guys, I promise. But the big thing here is that it does show that even though culturally Britain speaks English and so does America, they have better newspapers and propaganda, or more effective, I should say, because more Americans speak English. So the propaganda is more pro-British and anti-German in this era, but that is a knock against the British to go to war. Really, the Germans will be the one that have more knocks against them per se, and the reason is because of the nature of this war. It is a total war, and so basically uh, any part of any country, any belligerent country, is seen as fair game, and so we see that that leads to this unrestricted submarine warfare. Now, you could argue that Germany was simply acting in self-defense because Britain has just set up an entire blockade to kind of starve out Germany in the hopes of surrendering. And they are going to try and cripple Britain's shipping lanes in order to break that blockade. However, they're going to start targeting ships that are arguably not military targets, including a few passenger ships. And one of those is the British ship, the Lusitania. Now, that was a British ship, but about 100 Americans were on board when it was sunk. It was shot down, torpedoed with no warning. And so this gives a deep, deep anti-German sentiment in half of the country because Americans have now died in this war that we're not even involved in. And so the Lusitania makes Wilson demand that Germany knock it off or face strict accountability. So the rhetoric is escalating as a result of the Lusitania. Do they knock it off? Not for a little bit. They do shoot down a few other passenger ships, including one called the Sussex. And because they refuse to stop, Wilson issues the Sussex Pledge, where he threatens to cut off diplomatic ties with Germany. Now, that feels like a threat to go to war. So, Germany will agree to appease the US. They will end unrestricted submarine warfare. They will allow more cordial exchanges. Like, they'll search ships before torpedoing them. They'll let the crew and passengers, leave if they are going to shoot down the ship. And so it is, a little more graceful. And I should say they are specifically trying to not target passenger ships. But yeah. So anyhow, things calmed down for about a year, at least from the as far as America is concerned. But this war is not ending. It is not going away. And ultimately, Germany is still starving, and they are going to resume unrestricted submarine warfare within a year. It's an all-out bet, thinking that they can knock out Britain from this war before America gets mad enough that they broke their promise that we come and join the war against Germany. So they keep doing unrestricted submarine warfare. Wilson is angry about that. And then it comes out that there is a telegram, the Zimmerman telegram, where Germany is basically conspiring that if America declares war against Germany, that Mexico should declare war against America. That way, they keep us distracted, and that way, Germany can focus on finishing off the Allies. This is a direct violation of America's sphere of influence. America, ever since the Monroe Doctrine days, has said that we decide what goes on this hemisphere. And this Zimmerman telegram is Europe meddling in our affairs. So, once this happens, this is the final straw. The whole country is now overwhelmingly against German involvement. They want to go to war on the side of the Allies. Wilson realizes he can't avoid this, so he has Congress for a declaration of war, but reframes this war as a chance to not just end this war, but to end all wars. If we can stick the landing here and ensure that this war does not end with one side getting punished, one, that means there won't be another war just like it within exactly 20 years. But two, it could be the way we end this. He wants freedom of the seas, no secret treaties, disarm the world's militaries, self-determination for all, and a League of Nations to oversee these issues here. If we do this right, it could allow for some international coalition to talk things out before actually going to war. And so, it's a very noble idea, but it's also just the mark of American hubris right here. Wilson has solved world peace, and everyone should just listen to him because he is the smartest guy ever. Okay? So, anyhow, we're in the war now. What actually happens? Well, the actual mechanics of the war don't really matter because we just kind of show up and just kind of style on them. Like, we just throw bodies at the problem. We have a bunch of doughboys who are just young and inexperienced, and we just give them guns and send them to France. And a few go to the trenches, a few get shot, a few get PTSD, a few just get to go enjoy baguettes in the French countryside. But the sheer overwhelming numbers means that really the outcome was decided then and there. Just the Central Powers could no longer compete with the combined might of Britain and France, and not Russia because they left because of the revolution, but Britain and France and now the US. So that's all you really got to know about our place in the war. But what about what's going on at home? Well, during this war, we are going to see that the federal government becomes much more widespread, much bigger, and much more interventionist. We kind of saw these ideas being floated during the progressive era for business. So, what changes? Well, for the sake of the war effort, the US is going to go even further and straight up take over several businesses. We are going to literally nationalize the railroads for the sake of ensuring easy transition of goods and people to the war effort. So the populace got what they wanted. All it took was a world war. So we see that, yeah, just in one fell swoop, the railroads, they're ours now. Big business, who is she? And so, meanwhile, the Food Administration, we're going to use propaganda to encourage people to eat less, meatless Mondays. We're going to encourage farmers to overproduce. More on that next unit. And we are going to encourage people to buy war bonds to help fund for this war. And we're going to tax the rich. Um, we'll see that we're going to give laborers, people actually in the factories making these goods, just what they want. Higher pay for shorter hours. And if you go on strike, we will literally throw you in jail. More on that later in a sec here. Um, but yeah, so the idea is that we are ensuring that the war effort goes smoothly, and it's a scramble because really we were hoping to avoid this war, and as a result, we did not prepare for it. But all of these things that we see here were a pretty good effort considering we did them only after we declared war instead of getting ready beforehand. And we'll see, we learn from that mistake next time. What else? Um, Perhaps the biggest one is that the country is going to ensure that morale stays high for this war, and it's through the Committee on Public Information. So it's headed by a former muckraker, George Creel, and they're going to literally just encourage propaganda on a massive scale to just ensure that people know that Supporting the war is the good American thing to do. You're a patriot and you are going to do your part. So we smear propaganda everywhere. We make it look anti-German, very pro-American. Eat less meat, use less fuel. Listen to the 4 Minute Men, and also don't you dare oppose the war in any form, because if you do, we're going to use these new espionage and sedition acts against you. What are those? Well, what we're going to see is literally just like in the Civil War, we are suspending civil liberty here. You cannot distribute anything critical of the war effort or publish it in a newspaper. You can't talk bad about the government, the president, the flag. If you do, you can literally get thrown in jail for almost 20 years. And this is going to be enforced. We see that labor unions, strikers like the IWW, who went on strike when they specifically said you shouldn't, they will get thrown in jail over this. And if you're wondering if this is against your First Amendment rights, not anymore, it ain't. We will see, thanks to Shank v. US, they're going to argue that free speech can be restricted if the things you're saying represent a clear and present danger. And so, in this case, they're going to argue that being critical of the war effort is a clear and present danger to America itself. And so, it means several people are going to be stuck in jail for a very long time. And what we're seeing here is that although the government made things more efficient, it's also an unprecedented level of meddling in affairs. And we'll see how that expands even later into the next World War. Because, yeah, Wilson's all about freedom and speech and all that. But in reality, he's kind of trampling on civil liberties at home. And really, the hypocrisy doesn't go unnoticed. A bunch of women in this era, like Alice Paul from last unit, they notice that Wilson keeps talking about how this is a way to defend democracy, but half of America can't do democracy. So it's during this era, and as sort of a, you scratch my back, I scratch yours kind of deal for the women getting involved in factory jobs when the men were away, that the 19th Amendment is finally passed. More on that later. There's also a huge migration of African Americans, as they were also needed to fill the factory jobs. And so there's a bunch of African Americans living in the North now. More on that next chapter. All right. The last thing for World War I is how it all ends, the Treaty of Versailles. And so Wilson is going to break tradition and directly go to Paris to actually help negotiate. And this had never been done before. That and the fact that he never took any Republicans meant that the Republicans now took over the Senate. More on that in a sec. But anyhow, Wilson brings his 14 points to Versailles. He talks about how this is going to be the war to end all wars. As long as we don't come in with bloodshed, France and Britain are going to be like, we lost 10 million people here. Absolutely not. And so they are going to make Germany the loser of the war, give them heavy fines, and Wilson's 14 points will be outright ignored pretty much except for the League of Nations. But the big thing is that's the big one. That's the one that could possibly lead to this being the last war ever. So Wilson thinks he's got to win, and all he needs now is the Senate to ratify it. One small problem: his opponents now control the Senate. And so what we see is that the Republicans are going to oppose the Treaty of Versailles in two distinct ways. There are the irreconcilables, who straight up are not going to vote for this treaty. That's about 20 of the Senate right there. This is a foreign entanglement. They want nothing to do with it. Then there's the reservationists. They are okay with this league in theory, but they have things they want changed. And the biggest one is Henry Cabot Lodge and his lodge reservations. Now, these 14 reservations, the only one you had to know was that they don't like Article 10. That was that idea of how the League could make America get involved in another war without the US Congress's approval. That's the power that they have for themselves. They are not giving that up easy. And so we see that all they want is that amended. And really, that isn't that unreasonable. But Wilson is so stubborn that he will 100% refuse to compromise about this. He will go on a speaking tour across the whole country to explain why he's not going to compromise. He's going to give himself a stroke and he's going to get paralyzed for 7 months, and his wife will basically run the country without him even knowing it. But all this shows is Wilson is going to doom his own treaty. because he refuses to compromise. The Senate will not approve this. And as a result, the US will not ratify the Treaty of Versailles. We will not join the League of Nations, even though it was our idea. Wilson and his own stubbornness and inability to work with Congress basically doomed this from the get go. Now, you could argue that it's more complicated than this, but there are some that argue that this sheer inability to compromise might have literally caused World War II. This is a huge debate, but all it shows is that any meaningful gains from this era here were short lived, all because of just an inability to let go of an ego. And we'll see how that pans out next unit there. But anyhow, that's kind of the gist of what you should know about World War One from the American perspective. If you have any questions, feel free to let us know. We'll catch you in the next one here for the 1920s. All righty, folks, that's all the time we've got now. And yeah, have a lovely day and peace out, folks. All right, let's see.